It's Wednesday. Let's chat. I'm Kanan Chandran, the publisher of stormasia.com, and this is our regular series of discussions on topics of interest called the WED WEB Chat. It's on Wednesday, it's at lunchtime, and thank you for joining us during this session to hear the views of our panelists on this topic of COVID-19. Are we on the road to Are we on the road to recovery? Discovery is also part of it. We've been discovering all kinds of things as we got along. Right? So I think a year ago today, we entered the circuit breaker in Singapore. When we were stuck at home, we couldn't go out, we couldn't do anything to try and contain the COVID-19 virus. And I think that whole exercise has taught us not to take anything for granted. The very fact that COVID is still around and mutating, a lot of people have been knocked back by it. And this pandemic has made things very, very difficult for a lot of people. Things seem to be easing up in Singapore, slowly opening the borders. We're looking for bubbles to form so that we can travel to other countries. But it's not the same in other countries because they are also going through lockdowns in many parts of the world. So how do we get into a position where we can travel freely, we can conduct business as we used to before? Mutations don't help. We've got the latest strain, the E484K, also called the EEC mutation. And that seems to be resistant to vaccination. So are we on the road to recovery? So our panelists today include Dr. Sundardas Annamalay, who's the CEO of NTC Alliance Group of Companies. He's an award-winning entrepreneur, a best-selling author, and professor of natural medicine and naturopath practicing in Singapore. He has been in business for 31 years and has clients from more than 25 countries. And he's the president of the Society for Natural and Alternative Health Therapists. Welcome, Sundardas.
Hi, Kanan. Thanks for having me here.
Okay. And from France at 6:30 in the morning, 6:45 in the morning, up in Bright, Dr. Thierry Apoteker, the chairman of TAC Economics. Thierry left the banking industry in France in the early 1990s to create the first private research boutique in continental Europe. TAC Economics is now a fully independent research group providing economic, financial, and strategic research and advisory services to large corporations, governments, and multilateral institutions, and is involved in many academic activities. Thank you for waking up early, Thierry.
Thank you, Kanan. Hello to everybody from the western part of France.
Cool. And from the Philippines, we have Victor Dizon, co-founder of A2A Safaris and A2A Journeys, a former investment banker who has lived and worked in the US, Europe, and Asia. He has always had a passion for travel and safaris, which led him to co-found his company. From tailor-made safaris and journeys to South America and Antarctica, he is a strong advocate for the transformative power of travel. Thank you, Victor, for joining this session.
Oh, Kanan, hi. Thanks for having us.
Last but certainly not least, making up the group and beautifying the whole process is Monica Alsagoff, head of Singapore and marketing in Asia for A2A Safaris. She has had a varied career in luxury, hospitality, tourism, and retail branding for over 25 years. Monica has held senior positions in multinational corporations, luxury retail conglomerates, international PR consultancies, leading hospitality chains, global telecoms, family-oriented businesses, and many other things. So welcome, Monica, as well.
Hi, hello. Thanks for having us.
Welcome, everybody, to today's session. So are we all eager to travel? Are we all keen on getting out there? You know, as a very quick step poll, are we on the road to recovery? Sundardas, what do you think?
Pretty much so. I think we're on the road to recovery. How soon we get there will be determined by passports, especially the new emerging special passports, vaccine passports, and how soon different countries actually decide on what is the standard for wellness.
Okay. Victor, what do you reckon?
Well, I think, yes, similar to what Sundardas said, I think we're slowly on the road to recovery. I think what many people don't realize is even throughout last year, certain countries remained open both to travel out and to travel in. And like, for example, I was, spent almost a month around Africa over the Christmas holidays. No, so there are countries that remain open up to now. I mean, we have a business in the United States as well, and we've seen with the success of the vaccination there that the interest in inquiries has increased significantly over the last 2 months. No, so I think that's a good leading indicator of what's happening today.
Okay, Thierry, how about yourself?
Well, obviously, I have a slightly different views, not only being in Europe, so obviously not sharing the same maybe optimism that you may have in Singapore, but also because I'm a macroeconomist. And in that sense, we tend to see a lot of risks everywhere. And if I may just, share with you how we view the questions, not giving the answer, but how we view the question. So every single country has to manage a succession of 3 different loops, and each of these loop or phase would create different challenges, and each country follows the sequence of the 3 loops with a different schedule. And that makes it less, let's say, straightforward that when exactly the world is going to recover, because the answer would be completely different if you talk about Brazil today, or India or China. That would be completely different. If you talk about the US versus the Eurozone, completely different. The 3 loops. The first loop, the one in which most countries are still today. This is what we call the pandemic loop. Now, what does it mean? The pandemic loop means basically you're still facing a highly transmittable virus for which you have no cure except the vaccine, which is not yet rolled over. So for these countries, there is no other alternative. You lock down, you reduce the pressure on the hospital systems, on the health systems. Once the pressure on the health system is softer, then you open again until there is a new wave, and then you lock down again. Now, during this pandemic loop, you have partial stop and go movements. Every time you reopen, people rush to spend because they have constrained their spending for months. But a couple of months later, you lock it down again, and then you reduce. Now, you have this pandemic loop, very frankly, at least until either you have almost 60% of the population vaccinated, or you have a complete control of the virus transmission. Now, once you're there, you move to the second loop, which is the one in which the US and the UK are getting right now, which is what we call the confidence loop. Now, this is the best of all times, quote unquote, in the sense that you have all the catch-up process, all the precautionary saving made during the lockdowns that are ready to be spent. People want to go out, they want to go back traveling, they want to go back to restaurants, they want to spend. At the same time, you have a persistence of policy supportive measures. Now you have these 2 things coming together, and that's a boom. And you can expect growth, demand growth, retail sales, travel, whatever, to really boom over the next, let's say, couple of months, even couple of quarters in the US, in the UK, starting now. But the thing is, as we say as economists, there is no free lunch, in the sense that the cost of the pandemic has been huge everywhere. Meaning what? Meaning that once we get after this confidence loop, there will come a time, and the question is when for every single country, when you move into what we call the adjustment loop, where basically, what do you do with public debt to GDP moving to 140% in the US? Which is, if I may remind you, the level that created Eurozone tensions when Italy reached that level 10 years ago. Now, what do we do then? What do we do with a Federal Reserve Board, a European Central Bank, which have basically debased their currencies by multiplying by X their balance sheet? Now, all this will have a cost. And by the way, China is probably getting already into that adjustment loop. China, as we all know, was first in the pandemic, first in the confidence, and is now getting first into this adjustment loop. If I may just throw one question before stopping talking, why did the 2 sessions of the Communist Party in China published an objective of growth for this year above 6%, which is already achieved even before the first quarter, just with the carryover of growth in the last part of 2020. So even if there was absolutely no quarter-on-quarter growth in China today, for the whole year 2021, we would still be above 6%. So why on earth do you believe that the Chinese authorities have said, we have an objective of above 6? Simple answer, because we are already adjusting the policies. We are already going back to normalization of policies, and this will obviously be a different sequence. So to make a long story short, every single country is getting into these successive loops with different successes, with different speed, and we have what we call a asynchronous, completely asynchronous V-shaped recovery in front of us.
Can you say that it would be
Monica?
better if
Sorry?
globally? So, I mean, based on what you said, I totally agree. But because of different, like from the US to China and say Singapore, I mean, Singapore, we're a little red dot, you know, I mean, it's a lot easier to contain. But I think at the end of the day, it's global synchronization, isn't it? If all the large powers of the world could actually synchronize and talk to each other, and we actually do this almost similar timings, I think the world would be in a better space in terms of recovery. I think it's about communication. I mean, that's I guess a utopian, you know, my unicorn dream. But, you know, but I think it is a practical thing where it's all about synchronization. If every large nation, you know, then actually discuss and come to a consensus that we should synchronize in how we recover and how we move on, so that, you know, the whole travel bubble can't work if the rest of the world doesn't do the same.
So why is it you think that the countries of the world have not viewed this as seriously enough to want to do that, you think? To come together and find some sort of common ground to work on?
If I may just throw one idea there, is that, you know, this cyclical path to recovery that we're discussing, it's not occurring in out of the blue. It's occurring in a given global context that was there before the pandemic, and that's still there. And this global context, if I may just summarize it with 3 items. One is the China-US strategic rivalry, which is going to stay with us. So this, in terms of consensus building, pretty difficult, certainly, to get China and US getting to a common policy when part of their objective is precisely to prevent the other from reaching its objectives. The second one is the considerable changes, I think, underestimated in policy making. You know, who among us would have thought, you know, about these ballooning fiscal blah 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 and monetary things? So now we are in a completely different policy-making perspective, which is highly different according to jurisdictions. Now, China has a completely different view of the monetary policy usage as the US or Europe. Europe has a very biased thing because of our common currency. And the third one, which goes back to my friend panelists, is that we are in the midst of massive technological changes across a number of, let's say, structural sectors where competition is highly intensive. Now, none of these factors would very frankly support the assumptions that the world is ready to get on a kind of common platform, even though we have to recognize that despite this strategic rivalry, I think both China, the US, Europe today are keener to get on some sort of multilateral discussions than before, than during the Trump presidency.
Okay. Sundardas, I just wanted to get the perspective of naturopath. We've been hearing a lot about vaccines and a Western medicine sort of perspective on it. What does your community feel about vaccines and their effectiveness?
We had this conversation before. I'm going to say that the opinions in my community vary from one end of the spectrum to the other. It's a very wide, diverse perspective. One of them, the more conservative ones, are very pro-medical, very pro-vaccine, that's the right way to go and all of that. And then the extreme anti-vaccine people are furiously against it, talking about how it's going to change biochemistry, physiology, and you're using vaccines which interfere with epigenetics, the impact on downstream and your children's children and all of that. So that's this wide spectrum. Okay. Without even going into the vaccine issues and all of that, I think what the COVID situation does is it highlights current, or shall we say, practices and behaviors that were not very healthy before. Like we spent many hours in cold aircon environments. We were not exposed enough to the sun, so you have a vitamin D deficiency that will then lower your immune system. You don't sleep for long hours, so your immune system is further compromised. Habits that maybe our forefathers took for granted, but we have just decided we are paying it lip service. We no longer do that. So like for my community, when I'm giving them advice, I'm talking about sleeping well, exercising reasonably well, making sure at least you're doing supplements like vitamin D and zinc, which have been documented to support against your immune system against viral issues. And I know we had some conversations about the safety of, the risk factors with COVID. And if you actually look at it, the only situation that's different with the COVID virus versus your normal flu viruses is that it is highly transmittable. Okay, in terms of mortality rates, it's not the mortality rate that's an issue, although in some countries we're seeing massive high rates. And I'm going to say that what it does is that many times, many of the mortality rates attributed to the virus, if you were to compare it to, say, standard rates, you don't know how different they would be. So in other words, you have high-risk groups with cardiovascular issues and diabetic issues and other issues. If they died without having a virus sweeping across the world, we would take it as, oh, those are the normal stats. Now you've got something sweeping the world, so it's like, okay, that's the reason. So how do you...
It's accelerating the process?
Yeah, it's accelerating the process. The other thing here is that from a statistical perspective, I was having this conversation about 15 years ago with a medical doctor who also happened to sit on the statistics regarding how people died. And he talked about how if you actually looked at the reasons why people died and the way it was reported, most of the statistics were pretty valueless because it didn't really tell you why people died. Whenever somebody died and you didn't really know why, you put down something like bronchitis or you come up with a reason. Right? So that means that, people are dying. No problem. Death rates in some countries are really significant. All that is true. But is it really virus? Okay.
So
that's a question. I'm not saying it's not.
And the endpoint is the one in question, right? Yeah. But it's the issues leading up to it that contributed to the endpoint, right?
Yeah. So if you're actually leading a reasonably healthy life, and you're watching your physical and mental status. And the other issue with COVID is that because we all couldn't go out, we had to stay in, it aggravated and accelerated underlying emotional tensions, which are in fact sometimes even worse than the original COVID issues. You have relationships breaking down, marriages breaking down, families breaking down. Is it COVID doing that? Or was that undercurrent that was running deep in and people could cope with it because they didn't spend 12 hours or 24 hours locked down with each other? And now they are doing that, and suddenly it's like, oh my God, this is unmanageable.
COVID's a convenient scapegoat for this, then just spit it on COVID.
Yeah, and then
I'm
I don't
sure.
have to be accountable and responsible for my behavior, what I do, what I don't do, and my daily habits and behaviors. It's a virus.
So all this pent up frustration, Victor and Monica, you must be anticipating a huge surge for travel,
Yes.
right? Um, whether it's going to realize or not is another story, but and how soon and to what extent. But how does your industry cope with something like this, with so much uncertainty, and you need people to get out of the country to do things?
Well, I guess for starters, I think your statement, yes, there is a lot of pent up demand, but when that demand will actually be, materialize and crystallize is the big question. And I think it's what Terry was earlier saying. I think it's going to be different in each market. No, we're fortunate that we operate across different markets, across Asia, and then we also have a business in the US. It's interesting. I was just chatting, over the weekend to some of my colleagues who work with us in the US in our business, and as I said, what they're seeing now is a lot of interest. Not just interest; people are actually they're booking trips, booking flights, specifically for the upcoming summer months. But the interesting insight there is the demographic. In our U.S. business, historically, the big chunk of the market that goes to these remote luxury locations in Africa has been the retiree. We also call them the sort of silver-haired market. But now it's changed a little. Even though many of seniors in the United States have been vaccinated, they're still sort of holding back. So those who have trips planned for this year are still postponing, notwithstanding they've been vaccinated. So the ones that are really pushing ahead for this summer, the next few months, are the younger ones who have been vaccinated. So that's what we're seeing. In Asia, it's a little bit different, specifically in Hong Kong and Singapore, and to a certain extent China, because I think the big deterrent there right now, we have people who are keen to go, want to go with or without vaccine. The issue is the 14-day quarantines, or in the case of Hong Kong, 21-day quarantines upon return. So, if you go away for a 14-day holiday, or if you're lucky enough, a 20-day holiday, to come back home and then have to sort of, be locked up in a hotel. And in Hong Kong, it's the hotel of your choice. But in Singapore, it's a little bit of a lottery, and who knows where you may end up, And I've had to be in quarantine when I came back to the Philippines. I was only in quarantine for 24 hours, and I was very restless already. So I can imagine, being for 21 days. We've had some clients who've actually, from Hong Kong who went through the 21-day quarantine. I was chatting with him while they were, getting feedback. And initially it was okay. And maybe towards the end, he was regretting having gone on the holiday itself. So that, that's, I think right now in the markets where there are quarantines upon return, that is really the huge deterrent. Even though you're vaccinated, but you have to still, quarantine. That's the problem.
So do you reckon there'll be a dip in interest if the quarantine measures are not resolved?
I think in terms, the interest is there, but right now, as I said, it's not spurring anyone to action. And I think as long as those are not lifted in the markets where they're present, I think people will not travel. And I think this is not just for leisure. I talk, I have a lot of, I used to work in finance and banking, so I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are in the financial services sector in Singapore and Hong Kong. And even they are, very reticent to travel. Again, not for fear, it's just really, they don't like the idea when they get back from they go on a short business trip to Thailand, China, or wherever it is, they need to do a deal. They come back and they have to stay at a random hotel for 14 days, locked away from their spouse, partner, family, and just for a 2-3 day, 4-day business trip. There's an incongruity there. It's not worth it as far as they're concerned.
So I think it's more the, like for Singapore, I guess the travel bubble situation, like the minute the announcement of something between Singapore and Australia coming up in July, within the last few days, I've been having friends checking out flights, people were like a bit more optimistic, but like what you said, once that can be lifted or shortened, and plus of a hotel choice, I think that's probably would encourage more business and leisure travel for the economy to pack up. And I think because we're all coped up, like what both of you had said, that you get mental issues, and sometimes you either bond or you break up. And I think for us, will be probably more multi-generational travel. Families will come together, especially people in Europe and in America. They don't necessarily live in the same city or even in the same state. They could be 2-3 hours away and they can't visit each other, with the lockdowns. So I think especially for what I always call the fresh air travel, and for a lot of our clients who are repeat clients, they know what Africa is like, they know what Latin America is like, or Antarctica. They are not afraid to book. In fact, they're all postponing because they know that's the best social distancing destination and vacation you're going to get post-pandemic. Because you don't want to go to a city, you don't want to go to, a buzzy place. You want to go to a place where you can see the, stars and skies and, being surrounded by nature. I think I'm an urban girl, and until you go to Africa, you can't imagine the sheer beauty and God's grace. Literally,
Is this going to change the travel
Yes.
dynamics in terms of where people will want to travel now? Is that going to shift and change, you think?
Well, listen, in our business, we are getting a lot more inquiries. We're getting a lot from Middle East. From Singapore, we're getting like inquiries for bookings for 2022, 23, for birthdays or milestones, but not necessarily like what Victor said. The younger set, the 40-somethings now, they're all affluent doctors, lawyers, and all that, and they're all waiting to go, with their families, because they know that's probably the next best thing, right? The next is going to the city, which they will have to do for businesses or education. But from a leisure perspective, definitely the wide open spaces health is something that is become a priority for everyone. Everyone's looking at vitamins. I think these are the essentials that from your naturopath, holistics, therapies and all that, mental and physical. It's quite a key thing, I think, this last 1.5 years, because people are resting. You have time to cook for yourself, at home while you're working.
You can actually start living a healthier life if you wanted to, right?
Yes.
If you've chosen that path now.
Right.
But for you, Thierry, and for Victor as well, I mean, you don't have the same constraints that we do in Singapore, where we don't have anywhere to go. If you're stuck in this country, you're stuck in this little city and no choice, right? At least for you, you can head out. You are now in your home in the country, Thierry. So in the countryside, so you can escape the urban pressure, right? And similarly for you, Victor, if you wanted to, you can travel. So do you see that similar sort of shift happening in your markets as well?
Well, if I may just jump in here, again from the macro side, I think what you said is very important, and both Sundardas and Monica and Victor mentioned something which is very important: behavioral changes. I think that this pandemic is creating behavioral changes that may have taken 10 years to occur and that have been forcefully accelerated in terms of typically the way you travel, the type of pleasure you're going to seek in the travel, the kind of health protection you're going to seek for your, and at the same time, it's also creating, certainly at least in Europe, where we have an aging population, it's creating also a generational issue, where you find a lot of, let's say, the 20s to 30s-year-old person saying, well, are we going to sacrifice our kind of way of life a bit, to go back to what Sundardas said, to protect, let's say, a limited number of very old people who would have died in all cases to die, let's say, 6 months earlier? Do we have to sacrifice the way of life of a whole generation of millennials or what have you because of the, so all this is creating, I think, very substantial underlying changes. And to go back to your question, in France last summer, that was one of the best touristic seasons outside the luxury market, where indeed foreign tourists do have are the largest, clients, customer. But for the rest of the tourist industry in France, the fact that French people, it was difficult because of the different restrictions prevention measures. It was difficult to move outside. But well, in France, indeed, you have plenty of locations where French people will not go because it would not be, very, very attractive. But then there is a change also in that behavior, in that perspective.
Just to add what, if I may add to what Terry said, yes, I think that's a good point that you bring, because in our destinations, which are, let's say, in Africa or certain parts of South America, which were, very exclusive luxury locations, and the market for those had really been the, high net worth foreigners, as Terry had mentioned in certain places, like certain places in France. What happened last year was these markets, since they were at the beginning of the pandemic close to international travelers, they started refocusing on, domestic tourism. No, so even for a country like, say, Kenya, which has a lot of very exclusive high-end lodges. I mean, sure, they might not have a lot of very ultra affluent guys there who could afford $1,000-$2,000 per person per night, but they adjusted their cost structure to try and attract some of the the affluent local market, and some some countries were able to successfully do that. And I think that was one of the behavioral changes that even for those local guys in Kenya who would typically want to, an affluent guy in Kenya, he wants to go to London or he wants to go to New York or Hong Kong. Now, he's not able to do so. He just sort of starts traveling within his own country. So I think that's one thing we saw. The other, I think, behavioral change again here now for the international traveler is this now maybe less interest to visit big cities like Tokyo or Hong Kong. And as Monica had said, we have certain destinations that combine a city with an outdoor place, like the picture behind me, where there are only 10 people in a place twice the size of Singapore. So people are now saying, can we skip the city bit and just head directly to the outdoors? So that's we're seeing a lot more of that. So that's, I think this COVID really is affecting people's behaviors in that sense.
How do you think the whole process and the fact that you're getting mutations of the virus and lockdowns and opening up and then the lockdowns again? There are promises of bubbles, like Singapore was going to have one in Hong Kong that didn't materialize. How does that affect the economy now? Well, now there's definite impact, but how will it affect the economy down the line when you have this up and down uncertainty? Things would have fallen apart along the way. New things may have come up, no doubt, but where do you see the economies of the world sort of coming to some sort of even balance down the line?
Just from the macro side, the question is very difficult. When will we go back to what we call full normal? What is full normal? Pre-pandemic exact mechanism? Probably never. To something different, where you find behavioral adjustment to new risks, new uncertainties, new ways of meeting your aspiration, then this will be the sequence. You can say with fair degree of certainty that there will be these sequences that I mentioned earlier, US, UK getting to almost full normal by the summer. Then probably continental Europe, getting to full normal by the end of this year. China is already most normal. East Asia, Far East, almost normal. Then they will remain for a longer period of time. A number of, let's say, maybe less strategic countries as markets that especially within the emerging world, where you will have massive differences, and some of the countries will not be back to normal before mid-2022 or even end of 2022. If you take a country like Brazil, it's very unlikely that, considering the difficulties they have in controlling whatsoever the pandemic, plus the uncertainty on policies, plus everything you can list on Brazil, the way back to full normal pre-pandemic, another 1 year and a half.
Oh, but you still reckon we can get back to that stage, is it? Or do you see a definite shift away from that in a different sort of life here on?
Well, I guess, once again, these kind of three mega trends that were there before the pandemic and which have been somewhat accelerated by the pandemics will give way to a world that will be different. That will be different. China, US, that will remain with us, for the next decade. The policy making adjustment and problems, that's at least for a couple of years in front of us. And policy making is different already, completely different from the previous years. And technology certainly not going to slow down with the pandemic. On the contrary, it's been accelerating with the pandemic. So really, frankly, back to exact normal, it will not happen. But you would say this is the normal unfolding of history. No new, no scoop here that, tomorrow is always different from yesterday. But in terms of economic activity and sectors being unaffected by the health issue, that will start now, let's say in the couple of next few months in the US, next few quarters in Europe, unfortunately up to 2022, maybe mid 2022 for a number of large emerging markets or developing economies.
I just want to add to what Terry was saying. I think we will have a new normal. We are not going to go back to the way it was before. Look at retail in Singapore.
Yep.
It's going to change very dramatically. Look at how many people will work from home rather than going into the office, because now we find it's possible.
Yep.
But retail in Singapore was dying even before.
Yeah, it
the
was.
pandemic. So
the pandemic just made it
on the pandemic.
Speeded up certain trends. So when you said,
but what it has done is also brought people onto online space, the virtual element, right?
Yeah.
So
those were all occurring trends, but everything got speeded up. So when you said, are we going to go back to pre-pandemic? I agree with Terry. It's going to be a new norm. Some things will never come back.
Well, sorry, Victor.
I was just going to add, I guess, from the sort of travel perspective, I sort of agree. There will be a new normal, but what that will look like, I think, remains to be seen. That's still evolving, because I guess in terms of technology, travel, the travel experience doesn't, there's no technology for it. You can use technology to book your trip, but to go and it's really an experience. So you need to experience it in person. So that, I think, is not going to change. Now, how you get there and what you do once you're there, I think that's really, that will be interesting to see. Especially, I think the travel in more traditional travel. I mean, we deal in these non-traditional locations, as I said, like you go to an African safari camp that's 50,000 hectares and 20 people. There's really not going to be significant change in terms of what you do, because having gone there in the midst of the whole pandemic, it's still 95% the same as pre-pandemic. But like going to London, going to Paris, and those are cities I personally love as well. But can I go back into a crowded pub and get my pint and just go into a busy tube station all squished up? Is that still gonna happen? I don't know.
So I have a question which was sent to me earlier. It's about something called the Peltzman effect. This was something that came up in relation to automotive industry and about accidents and the fact that although you improve the safety of the car by introducing a lot of like seat belts and airbags and all, people took more risks because they felt they were safer. And so the number of accidents was still high and mortality was somewhat similar. But although that's been kind of knocked off a bit, but I'm just wondering whether a similar sort of thinking might apply here, in that people get vaccinated, they feel they're safer, they go out and take more risks than they had before because they would have washed their hands, they would have worn their masks, they would have kept a distance. But you look at what's happening in public now, people are close together. Yes, the masks are there, but some are like that, not worn properly. I don't see anybody cleaning their hands or whatever. But does that would that have an effect on how this virus is going to take advantage of the situation and come back stronger, maybe?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because it's really down to the risks that you're taking once you're getting vaccinated. What is the degree of risk that you take for yourself and for the others? To my knowledge, at least, but I'm not a medical doctor, even a person who has been vaccinated can transmit the virus. So in that sense, vaccination alone does require or does not prevent from distanciation, or at least some sort of preventive behavior. And once again, if you go back to this behavioral issue, I think this will remain with us. The fact that we've been all struck by something that was, let's say, expected but unpredictable, a pandemic, and that created massive changes in our way of life, whether we like them or not. This, I think, is creating a sense of, we are going to be hit again and again in the next years by occasional elements that will require a go back. Now, whether this, when you open up back after a long time of lockdown, does it lead people to adopt risky behavior? Very difficult to say at this stage. At least from the economic side, very difficult to say.
Well, but from a human nature perspective, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the governments come in, and there must be mandatory rules that globally you have to follow. You can't go to a place when I've heard where nobody's wearing a mask.
Yeah.
And then and in Singapore, sometimes you forget, people actually remind you, or they give you a really scary looks, right? So yeah, you're right, it's adaptability, Kanan. I think at the end of the day, you've got to go with the flow. Mindsets have to change. Health has to be a priority, because at least if your immunity is strong, you can fight against whatever, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
so
big generation of millennials of being stuck, gamers and all that, need to do it outdoors.
Yeah. You're also gonna have herd immunity, and herd immunity together with new emerging variants. So it's going to be very interesting. And once this pandemic has started, there is a higher likelihood that 5 to 7 to 10 years later, you're going to have another pandemic. Right? We actually looked at this.
Will it be
SARS
worse?
was some time ago, and they talked about how after SARS, you're going to have another monster. And this is not that monster.
Oh, not yet.
Oh, not yet. So we have a bigger monster coming up.
Yeah.
Oh.
Is this just the baby one then?
This is a baby one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a baby one. Now, the interesting thing though is that if you actually have a viral strain that is lethal, it will become self-limiting. It's the virus strains that are not lethal that are not self-limiting. They are highly infectious, but not so lethal that are not self-limiting. So it's a kind of an oxymoronic situation.
What is the possibility that COVID and the possibility of a disease X will render catastrophic results? So could we go the way of the dinosaurs? And second question was, do you think the authorities, leaders are looking at worst case scenarios and thinking of a game plan?
Short version is they probably are.
Yep.
Yeah, but how do you think of a game plan when you're not quite sure what the scenario is how the scenario is going to play out?
I think the short answer to that is you think of multiple game plans with multiple possible outcomes, and for each game plan there is a different management system, and then you wait to see which one comes up.
Do you think things like artificial intelligence would come into play here and be
most definitely
help save mankind?
Not necessarily to save mankind, but limit the number of people dying.
Well, I mean, that is in a way saving mankind, or prolonging the
agony
existence.
The problem,
it's like a Star Trek, right? Where we can teleport ourselves so that it kills all virus through space and time.
And the problem, I guess, it's further exacerbated because I guess we were talking about game plans. I guess each country or each government can try and do that. Some obviously better than others, but because it's truly a global pandemic, if your plan, maybe in some sense Singapore has been successful in that regard, where they've to some extent closed themselves off. You've got cases pretty much down, but you had to essentially shutter yourself off from the rest of the world, which is sort of contrary to what Singapore was all about, sort of previously, in terms of economic trade and business. And can you do how long? And maybe that's a plan, and it works. It keeps people safe, but will that really keep the economy chugging along and the populace happy for if you had to do that for 5 years? I'm guessing probably not.
Yeah.
Maybe it's good for a year or two, but 5-10 years, that's not a realistic game plan to just close yourself. You'll just become a North Korea, kind of.
True. I think every country will view this differently because they have their own needs, they have their own capabilities, and even with the way the testing is done, there is no uniformity at this point in time. Vaccine passports, you don't know how they're going to be uniformly applied. So you need to bring the world to a level where every country is able to follow a set of guidelines and adhere to them, right? Which at this point, it's a bit of a challenge. So it's 1:32, so we are at the end point of our discussion. It always flies very quickly. But thank you again to Sundardas, Thierry, Monica, and Victor for being on this chat, waking up early and connecting with us in the case of Thierry. But clearly, you all think we are on the road to recovery. We're not. I don't think recovery will mean we will be as we were in the past, and the road may look a bit different as well down the line. I think we have seen certain benefits come out of COVID, and that it's accelerated the whole digital push. The technology has been accelerated, so that's been helpful. It has meant also that at a personal level, we've been kind of struck hard, many of us, because of the inability to interact with others as we would have. And the need to find new ways of connecting with people we may not want to connect so much with, but have to, right? But it's an ongoing journey, I think. So we'll have to see what happens and how things play out.